Would everyone like to take a seat? Do we need more chairs? Everyone comfortable? Great. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Blue Sky. My name is Molly Newgard, and I'm the executive director here, and it's very much my pleasure to welcome all of you to this space, as well as, you might not know, but we have people joining us on Zoom as well. So we're excited for this afternoon's program. I would like to actually start by reading our land acknowledgement statement. We at Blue Sky humbly acknowledge that our programming is being held on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia, Wimal, and Willamette rivers. Thank you. We are delighted to have with us today family and close friends of Ward Shortridge. They're very graciously willing to share their stories and thoughts and perspectives on Ward. Some of you may know or may not know, but Ward was a very unique contributor to the Portland art scene, photography community, and he passed away in December 2019. And it's very much an honor for us at Blue Sky to host this memorial exhibition. And I will also say that I've learned over the past several hours, few days, that Ward was also a very unique person. There were several people who mentioned in their statements about Ward that he was one of the most impactful people in their lives. And I think for all of us who are human beings as well as creators, we bring a lot of that, of who we are, to our artwork. And I think it's a testament to the work that we see surrounding us today. I would like to acknowledge and thank those who made this exhibition possible. So our amazing staff at Blue Sky, our volunteers, our interns, our volunteer board, our volunteer exhibition committee, and especially Bobby Abrahamson, who his vision was first brought to the exhibition committee at Blue Sky, and the result is what you see here surrounding us today. So thank you, Bobby. And I would also like to thank our members, our donors, our contributors, our institutional funders who help to keep Blue Sky going day after day. So thank you all very much. I would also like to thank Open Signal. Open Signal is here today to bring us this hybrid experience. So it's also a disclaimer, too, that this is not the way that Blue Sky in-person programs will go going forward, but we are very delighted that we can make this happen today. So that means that we have an in-person audience, and we also have people joining us via Zoom who will be able to share questions and comments with us through the chat. So I will have the pleasure of introducing our panel in just a moment, but just the way that things will work is that our panelists will have a chance to share a little bit about Ward or their experiences. And then I will have some questions posed to them. And then we also encourage the audience to think of questions that you might want to bring to the panel. I encourage those of you on Zoom to write your questions or comments into the chat, and I will do my best to make sure that those are addressed as well. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our illustrious panel. And again, I think they're very generous and kind in offering their time and perspectives and histories and stories, because it's filling in a lot of the gaps that maybe we don't know about, but helps us to better understand who Ward was as a person and a photographer. So I have name tags up there. I don't know if all of you can see them, but we have Matt Shortridge. Matt is Ward's younger brother, who traveled all the way from Wisconsin. I think a small town.
Yep.
All right. And we have Carla Danley. So Carla and Ward met as co-workers in the emergency department at Laurel Regional Hospital in Laurel, Maryland in 2003. They married the following year and remained partners until the end of Ward's life. We have Rebecca Sinclair, retired Portland-based mental health therapist who was a colleague at Reliant Behavioral Health with Ward and became a very close friend of his. And we have Bobby Abrahamson on the end here, and Bobby, Portland-based documentary photographer, a very close friend of Ward's and a photographic colleague. And Bobby currently holds the archive of Ward's work, and thus is responsible for organizing this exhibition. So join me in welcoming the panelists. Okay, so Bobby, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So I want to thank Blue Sky and the exhibition committee for selecting the show, and thank Matt and Carla and Rebecca for being a part of the panel, and thank everybody for being here, and thank a lot of people who helped me along the way in many regards. It's too many for me to try to recall because I'll forget somebody, but people helped me with the framing and cutting mats and selecting pictures and so on, for all the way back from the time of the submission. So I'm just going to keep this brief, but I'll let you ask more questions later. But I met Ward in like 2010 or something like that, 8 or 9. It's written in the book, but he took a class at New Space Center for Photography called Ugly, Shocking, and Bizarre, which the intent of the class was to try to come up with unusual assignments to try to push people outside of their creative boxes. And Ward showed up, and I didn't know what I was getting into in terms of what a dynamo of a person and a photographer he was. I mean, he seemed kind of quiet when he first arrived, and then he took every assignment and went just bonzo with it and did the most brave things, and he was just processing the death of his father that had happened just a month or two before, and like everyone was deep and heavy, every place he went with his assignments. And then he showed his portraits that he was shooting in Portland and the portraits that he had shot in Washington, D.C., and I knew I had met a kindred spirit. I'd like to think my photos are somewhere as good as these, but Ward, I said ever afterwards, he was by far my favorite photographer I knew in Portland, the best photographer I knew in Portland. So I was always pushing him to have a show. He was, I would say, sometimes interested and often ambivalent about it. He'd say things like, I don't know what's the point. The reason I take these pictures is for the people in the pictures, and I don't know if my work is really good enough. Isn't it just kind of like every other kind of portraits you see of people on the street? And then he finally did this residency at New Space. If y'all don't know about New Space was this great community photo center in Southeast Portland that had classes and darkroom usage, rental, and exhibition space. And Ward applied and got a residency there to print his pictures, and he gave them his 4x5 Bestseller Enlarger that was outfitted specially for disabilities. And I mean, that's something that I don't think Ward really wanted to have focused on about his work, but it's very important from my perspective that you understand that Ward had muscular dystrophy, and as long as I knew him, he was operating out of a wheelchair, an electric wheelchair, and camera on a tripod between his legs. And so he got this darkroom set up. He gave his equipment in New Space, and then he was in there printing for a month. And that was like the first time that I know of that he had any kind of exhibition of his work. And it was just like a one-day event. And some of the prints that are on the wall across from the drawers those are some of the prints that he printed for that. So anyway, he just never got around to submitting that work to Blue Sky, and then he started shooting these other shots, the houses, at the end of his life, which you could read the essays. I think for me, it's totally connected. I think when I showed people Ward's work, sometimes they thought like, well, gee, his portraits are great, but what's with these houses? I think you really need to read Ward's own words to get it. Ward was really, I think, aware of his own mortality at that. I think his whole life he was aware of his mortality, but I think he knew that, his time was really limited, and he saw, I think you said this, Matt, that it was like kind of therapy for himself at that point, sort of like processing or comforting himself, about what was coming down the road for himself. But anyway, he was going to submit that work for a show, and so he printed all those in the back room, the houses, on a printer that he bought, and inkjet printer, and so he was scanning his 2 1/4 negatives, but everything shot on film, and I printed all the portraits, which I'm sure a question will come to me later, why didn't I just put Ward's pictures in frames? And the simple answer would be, I I just didn't think there were enough of them that were good enough. And I think that could raise a whole another debate about authorship and that kind of idea of, if they're not the pictures that Ward printed, is this the show that Ward would even want, or is this even Ward's show, or something like that. But I solved it for myself. For the 2 months that I was printing all the pictures, I had just an endless conversation with Ward. He's gone at this point, so. But there was this conversation I could just give you a piece of. It's like, and pardon the bad words here, but it's like, what the fuck are you doing, Bobby? I'm printing a show for you. Like, I wouldn't do it that way, And I'm like, well, screw you, Ward. I mean, you're gone, and it's not for you. And he's like, you really need to burn that more. You need to dodge those eyes more. You can make a better print on an inkjet printer now. Why are you even doing it in the darkroom? And I said, because I'm with you when I print every one of these pictures. I'm with you when you're standing right in front of that person there. That piece of film was in the camera with Ward and that person, and now I'm taking a picture again. I'm getting to be there, and it was really a wonderful experience. I actually had COVID while I was printing these pictures, and Ward, his death was caused because he couldn't breathe enough. I don't think it was COVID, but it wasn't COVID related, but he was having breathing issues his whole life. Somehow, I'm telling you too much, but people have asked me, like, why'd you do all this, or, and all I can say is it was one of the most joyful, beautiful, wonderful experiences to print his pictures and to put together this show. And I feel Ward's presence more in my life than I ever have since he died. So that's, I guess, my opening statement about it all.
Thank you, Bobby, so much. You'll all have questions that you'll be able to direct to either all panelists or your choice of panelists later. So, Matt, would you like to continue?
Yeah, I've known Ward since 1964, when I was born, and he, he was a perfectly normal, tormenting older brother who would play practical jokes on me, and he was. There was so much. Pete and Carl and I were talking, as my friends from across the street when we were kids, were talking after the morning segment, and so much of the discussion about him as an adult and as a social worker and stuff were, speaking to his deep compassion and his like incredible ability to just see right into people's hearts and understand them, and those were the gifts that made him such a brilliant friend and a brilliant artist, and it allowed him to connect with the subjects of all these pictures in such a profound way. And but as a kid, when we were younger, he was he was wrestling with so many profound things. Our family was split, and he was sort of, through a variety of kind of unfortunate circumstances, he and I were divided between our parents, and so we spent, he felt, it was really hard for him to be kind of sort of sent away, in a sense, to live with my dad, and the life with my dad was very difficult, and not a very warm environment, and so he was coping, trying to figure out who he was at this time, as a 8-year-old, 10-year-old teenage, and early teenager, and all the while he's also seeing his physique kind of, not developing in the way that other kids were, and he looked different and he walked different, and he also thought different, like he had all these, the adult that we came to know was like in there and evolving and growing, and his his very deep ability to just empathetically deal with the world was there, but it was being beaten around by so many hard forces, and so in the middle of his high school years, he came back to my mom's place, and there was this huge kind of exhale and kind of a blowing off of steam from the challenging times that he had living with my dad. And he, you know, those years were just completely like explosive for him, because I think part of it is he saw his physical mobility kind of teetering in this precarious way, you know, that like, what's going to happen to me? Like, who am I going to become, and how am I going to deal with the world? All these big questions that are hard enough to figure out when everything's kind of going so, you know, really smoothly in your life. And for him, it was just like, you know, really tricky. So, you know, in those years, you know, between, you know, like his late teenage years through his 20s, you know, he was in like a seriously dark place, you know, tons of drugs and psychedelics and smoking pot, and there was like pot plants growing in the carpet in his bedroom and stuff like that. And he was, you know, he was like super cool and funny and interesting, but it was like, there was like a dark, sarcastic, you know, cynical view of the world. Like, he really was like, he wasn't like at all happy about the world, you know. The world was like a really crappy place for him, and he didn't know, but then like, well, the person that we came to know was in there, this like deeply compassionate, empathetic person who's just like an amazing friend and all that kind of stuff was in there, but it was like wrestling, you know. There's like this incredible inner turmoil for him as a kid, you know, as a young adult, and a lot of that energy just had to kind of come out and go, you know, into like, you know, it came out in like, you know, reckless car, you know, driving, like what Pete was talking about earlier, and you know, and just substance experimentation and kind of histrionic like mischief in public spheres, where he would like kind of mess with people's minds and kind of play mind games with people and stuff like that. And then somehow he was able to kind of like digest all that and process it, and kind of, you know, he went through all those years, and he was able to kind of come out of it and say and make this conversion into the adult that we came to know. And I think his empathy and his gifts as a social worker and as an artist, and his gifts for connecting to all these people that are in these frames behind us, you know, so much of that came from how he had to, the immense amount of work that he had to do to kind of come to grips with his own situation. And it's not just the dystrophy. Like, the dystrophy is like this one piece of that equation, but it was also the challenge of being kind of tossed around like a pawn in the family, and I think also the depression was also a big theme for my dad and for my grandfather and me to an extent, but nothing like for him. It was really like a major specter that it took him a long time to kind of really wrestle to the ground, but he did. And that was another one of the stories that came up this morning, was like this period late, just in the last 5 years or so, where he would like kind of get the depression at bay and kind of hold it down and defeat it and have a really positive couple of years, and then it would come back. I mean, we all know how that rhythm can be with countless people that we know that deal with depression and other mental illnesses and stuff like that. And it was a conversation I had with Carla one time where I hadn't really I always knew he struggled with depression and everything, but Carla said to me one time, she's like, the depression is like way more of a problem than the dystrophy. And I was like, get out of here, no way, because I sort of clung to the idea like that all of his problems that all of his struggle came from the dystrophy. And, it is a huge thing, but, the depression was every bit as much of a burden. But it's like all of those things are what allows, they're the things that were so hard, but they're also the things that allowed him to do this work, to a large extent, I think, because it's like he can see into these people that are like, that he meets and gets to know. I mean, he really like connects with people before he would do the portraits and stuff, and it would be like, finally, here's somebody that I can relate to, and I think in a lot of cases. And he always sort of thought of me as like this happy-go-lucky kid who like everything was perfect, and I was like in student government, and like I was friends with cheerleaders and all this kind of stuff in high school, and I think he had a hard time, he and I kind of struggled to relate in a lot of ways, because I would be like, I was living this kind of like Andy Griffith childhood, and so he kind of held back a lot of the realities of his experience, and I knew that it was hard for him to be, that he was living with my dad. I know that it was painful and everything, but it wasn't until later that I realized how the extent of those kinds of things. So, I mean, that was another kind of expression of his empathy and the way he kind of dealt with things is he kind of protected me from everything that was inside of him, and kind of kept like a sneeze guard at a salad bar or something in between us, and it was a theme for years and years and years where I would realize that he was connecting with other people, other friends of mine, a lot of times in a much more like unshielded manner, and he would really like let other people into the really darkest parts of himself more than he would let me into those things. I mean, partly like I just wasn't like equipped to handle it in a lot of ways either, too. I was kind of like, I just wanted to pretend that everything was just fine and everything was okay, but it took me a long time to kind of realize those deeper structures, but that's how we all grow up, eventually. So, but thank you all for being here, and thank you, Bobby, for making the show happen.
Thank you, Matt. Carla?
I guess first, can I do this? Matt's wife can attest that I had a negative COVID test last night. So are people comfortable with me doing this? Can I do this? Thank you. So yeah, I'm neither as, eloquent or as linear as Matt and Bobby, and so I have a couple notes here because I'm kind of popcorning all over the place. But I wanted to just first offer an asterisk to what Matt shared. Matt and Ward had an older sister, Sarah, who, when the family was split up, Sarah was with Matt, and so Ward was alone with his dad and stepmother. And he talked a lot about how, in many ways, Sarah was the only person who really, really got him. And so that loss, which was, a random freak accident, she was hit by a car while she was riding her bicycle. Ward was 14 and Sarah was 16 when that happened. So that was a really profound loss to him at a really kind of tender time. And I think that's sort of, something to pull forward. But when I was asked to participate on this panel, my question, sort of the koan for myself was, what is mine to tell? Because I didn't share Ward's artistic life with him. I'm not a photographer. I wasn't out with him when he was shooting. And, I don't know the very early part of Ward's life, but what sort of came to me is that what was mine to talk about was the elephant in the room, which was his disability. And it had, a profound impact on him for all of his life. So I just wanted to share about that. Oftentimes people will think, because they know that I'm a nurse, that, because that must have been great, Ward was married to a nurse and you know all about these things. I didn't learn anything about disability in nursing school. I didn't learn anything about disability working as a nurse. What I came to learn about disability, I really came to learn from sharing, an embodied life with Ward. And I wanted to start out by talking about sort of his memory of his diagnosis, and I can't talk about the veracity of this. This is just as he remembers it, and he shared it with me. So, Ward was born in 1960, and he was diagnosed late in the 60s. And just to put this in some context, right now there is a whole academic field of study called child life. And so when children are hospitalized, there are professionals who come in to make sure that they have a life that's as whole as possible while they're in the hospital. This was not a thing that existed in the 60s. And also bioethics, as we know it, was not a thing in the 60s. The Tuskegee syphilis study was still happening. So, so Ward was taken from his parents to NIH, maybe 8, 9 years old. And the way that he remembers it is that he was, for a period of days, surrounded by all of these men in white coats who were, doing all of these muscle tests on him, which involved sticking electrodes in his muscles, not with anesthesia, because they needed to know, what his sensation was. He doesn't really remember his parents spending a lot of time there at the time, and that was very frightening to him. And it's sort of, when we think about that now, we can't really imagine sort of treating a child like a lab specimen in that way, but that was the practice at the time. He also talked a lot about as an elementary and middle school kid being the victim of a tremendous amount of bullying. And again, in the modern age, we understand bullying, we understand that it's wrong. There's, some agreement around that. And at the time, I think, the understanding was, boys will be boys, and, that's just how kids are. So Ward tells this story about being in a Boy Scout troop. And, for fun and games, the bigger kids would, beat up on the little kids. And, one day the big kids decided that, the fun thing to do would be to grab all the, younger, weaker kids and, shove their head in the latrine. And so, one by one, this, happened. And then, Ward knew obviously it was going to be his turn. And so he just sort of shook the kids off and just walked over to the latrine and just stuck his head in the toilet. And everyone was like, and then he was like, there, okay, I did it, So now you don't have to do it because I've already done it. And I was thinking too, sort of as a society, the way that we have evolved to think about disability. I mean, we're taught as young children not to stare. You see someone in a wheelchair, don't stare, it's impolite to stare. And so there's almost this, it ends up translating into this abrupt and purposeful turning away from people, and sometimes even kind of recoiling in horror, And I remember, early on when Ward and I were dating, and I'm really excited about this new guy in my life, and we'd be going down the street together, and I would literally see people kind of look at his body and just recoil in horror. And I was like, imagine going through life like that, And sort of on the flip side of that, some people would just stare, usually young kids, but just would really, really stare really intensely. And it has the effect of being invisible and hypervisible at the same time. And so, in this particular time, particular place, particular neighborhood, it's sort of hard to remember that there was a time that, seeing people sleeping on the street was unknown and unheard of. I can remember back that far. And so, when Ward started taking pictures in DuPont Circle, this was not homelessness as we know it today. This was this really strange, unusual, we had not seen this before. This was a new phenomenon in prosperous America. And I think because Ward had had this experience of being invisible and hypervisible at the same time, that he was really able to connect with people that everyone else was trying not to see. or staring at, gawking or averting their eyes. And, and it allowed him to make a connection with them, and they felt seen by him, and he saw their humanity, and they saw his humanity, and he saw theirs. He spent a lot of time in DuPont Circle while he was in grad school, and he'd take pictures of people, and he'd come back after he'd been in the dark room and give them their pictures, and then he sort of became a little bit of a celebrity, kind of like, oh, that's cameraman. So if someone was starting to hassle him, as sometimes street people would do, someone would come to his defense and say, oh, don't bother him, he's all right, he's cameraman, he's one of us. I also wanted to talk about, just along the theme of our evolving, understanding and view of disability. When Ward was in grad school, there was a protest in 1990, and it was called the Capitol Crawl, and it was at the time that they were holding arguments to legislate what would later become the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so what the Capitol Crawl was over 1,000 wheelchair users marched from the White House to the U.S. Capitol, threw themselves out of their wheelchairs onto the ground, and crawled up the steps. And for, a young grad student in a wheelchair to sort of see that many people having that kind of direct political action just kind of blew his mind. He was working on a master's degree in social work at the time, and he had an assignment to, write about some civil rights issue. And just, having, seen this Capitol Crawl, he wanted to write about disability as a civil rights issue, and his faculty member told him that that was not a legitimate topic, that he needed to, talk about race or something like that. Yeah, so, we've changed, we've evolved, yeah. Early in my relationship with him, one of the things that I was able to, something that really resonated with me was some of the parallels between disability struggles and Jim Crow. We struggled a lot to look for barrier-free housing here, and for the first time I realized what it was like to not be able to live somewhere that you would choose to live, not because of your credit scores or not because you weren't able to afford the place, but simply because of who you were. And, seeing that from the point of view of someone in a chair kind of, really helped me understand, what people from my community went through earlier. Also, when we, went to restaurants, it was not unusual for the wait staff to look at him and then look at me and ask me what he wanted to eat, as though, that was a thing. Or, looking up some place online and seeing that it was wheelchair accessible and, going out to this nice place and having your nice clothes on, only to discover that the wheelchair access was in the back through the, urine-stenched alley, going alongside the kitchen and, all the grease mats. And, by the time you finally navigated, the urine in the alley and, the grease in the kitchen, finally you might be able to sit somewhere in the back in the corner in the dark. We also, when we lived in Ann Arbor, there was a class at the University of Michigan called Disability and Culture, and the professor welcomed people from the community to sit in on those lectures. And a friend of ours, Peg Ball, who was an activist with ADAPT, was a guest speaker for the class one day. And so Ward and I went, and Peg, who was a little bit older than us, talked about when she was in school, and of course at that time, people with disabilities were not integrated with the general education population. She went to a special residential school, and there was lots of emphasis on being as independent as possible. So they were teaching her how to dress herself, put her on her own clothes. And what she said was, eventually she did learn to, use her teeth, use part of one hand, to dress herself, but she said it took forever. It could take, an hour or more for her to get her clothes on, and by that time she was completely exhausted and, didn't really want to do anything else with her day. And as an adult, when she was able to live on her own, she realized that, having personal care attendants didn't make her less able. It actually allowed her to, get out and enjoy the day and get out and be productive and, and take part in life. People often ask me why Ward didn't have a personal care attendant, and he didn't for many, 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 many years. And I think a lot of it had to do with Ward being from that generation that, independence meant you just had to do everything for yourself for as long as possible, as much as possible, even sort of to your own detriment. So there were many, many years, well, maybe about 4 to 5 years where Ward wasn't shooting at all, partially due to depression, but partially because he was just so exhausted, and the energy that he had really went into just getting himself vertical out of bed and dressed, and by that time he was spent, and he wouldn't have had the energy to go out and shoot. I don't think he ever would have chosen to have personal care attendants, but his hand was forced when his disability progressed to the point that there was really no other choice. And it was really at that point when he was no longer able to dress himself and get himself up into his chair, and other people were doing that for him, that he actually had the physical energy to go out and shoot again. I mean, there was a time when he told Bobby, "Here, I'm giving you all my equipment because I'm done with photography." But then, excuse me, I have to grab some water. After he had, some physical support, he actually, then had the resources, mentally and physically, to pick up the camera again and go out and shoot. And, he always talked about how having a disability, there were just so many more things that you had to navigate and think about constantly that able-bodied people don't have to just sort of have going in the back of their mind all the time. Just something as simple as, where am I going to go to the bathroom? How am I going to go to the bathroom? I think one of the ways that his chair, especially the scooter that he had, kind of served him as a photographer, is it sort of allowed him a little bit of stealth. I think about, if someone else had, a medium format camera on a tripod, because it's big and it's heavy, and they decide, well, I don't want my shot from here, I think I want to go over there, in a very conspicuous way, you got to pick up the tripod and the camera and walk over there, and people kind of know what you're doing. But in Ward's chair, he was able to set up his tripod just on the platform of his scooter, and you didn't really know if he was just kind of going for a walk or if he was actually shooting. Was he looking in the viewfinder, or is he just kind of chilling? And it allowed him a way to kind of, crab and dolly and kind of work his way into his subject, in a way that was not so conspicuous. And, so both physically and emotionally, he didn't separate himself from his subjects, that he was really able to kind of, weave his way in like that. Another sort of snippet that I wanted to share is, especially about the DuPont Circle days, is that, because, and to some degree too, the houses, too, because I'm just recently getting familiar with the House series, is that it's not what Detroiters used to disparage as ruin porn. You know, now because we see homelessness everywhere and there's decay everywhere, there's this kind of, you know, voyeuristic kind of photography that happens that's kind of exploitative in feel. But, you know, what I like about the houses in particular is that, you know, it's not, as I said, it's not Detroit ruin porn where, you know, the houses aren't so far gone that, you know, there's just like one wall left and weeds all over it. But he's just starting to see that edge, just the very beginning of, oh, something else is about to happen here. And maybe there's going to be an intervention and someone's going to move in and gentrify it, and it's going to be, you know, this, you know, like Shishi Tony Airbnb, but maybe not, you know, and maybe it's going to go in that direction. And, you know, also with his portraits, his street portraits, I think he was sort of prescient in terms of seeing what was about to happen, you know, seeing the nascent about to be homelessness epidemic that we now are all very familiar with. So I'm just going to kind of take a pause there and kind of step back. But those were just sort of the sort of broad brushstrokes of things that I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Carla. And Rebecca.
Oh, what can I say after all of this amazing information and connection and love? It brought up some thoughts to me. I'm not at all organized, but I met Ward in 2010 because I was working at a behavioral health group here in Portland, and that group had just gotten a new contract, which was brand new in Oregon, to monitor healthcare professionals, physicians, nurses, and dentists, and pharmacists who were either had a substance abuse disorder or mental health disorder or co-occurring. So this meant that as therapists, we were not supposed to do therapy. We were just supposed to really monitor progress, get all the information about how they were doing, keep the public safe, and help support them through their treatment process and make sure that they could continue to keep their license and get back into the workplace. And it's probably the most intense work I'd ever experienced, after having been a therapist for over 30 years at that time. So when the program started, we had just started to develop a team, and I met Ward as he rolled down the hall towards our team, and hi, I'm one of your new team members. And it was just, actually it was an exciting feeling to know that here comes this person to help our team out, because in one day we had 400 files that were about this thick just landed in our office. And we spent weekends, we spent tons of time. We had to go through all these pieces of information about every doctor, nurse, and all the folks we were going to work with, and try to retain it and use a computer program that was not a therapeutic one. It was a very difficult one for me to learn. But Ward came in and bing, 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 he got the idea, he knew how to use the program. And true to Ward's form, and probably kind of like me, not doing therapy wasn't going to be an option, whether we were supposed to or not. We ended up on the phone with people who were really suffering and struggling, and we both, and I think some of the other members on our team also helped these folks in a therapeutic way. We're working with them to really try to help them maintain their job and to keep the public safe. And one of the points when I was still where I had some surgery and I'm laying in bed and I don't do well with narcotics, so I didn't really have much of that going on. And the nurse that was helping me, I knew was impaired. I mean, my urine bag was all over the floor. She was going to give me the wrong medication. And it was a little scary being in the profession I was and noticing this and thinking about all the other people who wouldn't have had the awareness. And finally, someone came and said they removed her from my room and just said, well, she had a headache and she needed to go home. We're going to replace her. So it's very real. So be careful when you go to the seat, when you're in the hospital. I mean, Carla, I know you work in surgery, but. So Ward and I became very close pretty quickly because we worked in such an intense atmosphere. And it was very clear immediately that his heart was huge. He was extremely bright. He was very compassionate and empathetic. And you could hear that on the phone when he was talking to anyone that needed help. And we needed to be really bing on our work schedules. And his door was always open. It didn't matter who it was. And he was on the phone as long as he needed to be, as long as someone needed to be with him. And he also, his door was open to any of us who wanted to walk in. It was just, yeah, he was there to give us his time. I really think that Ward had a way of seeing the uniqueness and the specialness and the humanness in everyone that he was with. You just really felt that. And coming here was his feeling of me. I feel very humbled. I feel so honored to even think that he would choose me as a friend. Because I think of him as this just incredible man who was very loved, quick wit, funny, can be sarcastic, and really cared. And when you were talking, Carla, I forgot all about this, but I'm sure that these are things I shared with Ward, maybe some of the reasons he also could relate to me, I hope. When I was really young, that was like 21, I ended up in Washington, D.C. for a while, and very accidentally got a job as a legislative aide to Senator Bob Dole for people who were handicapped, and I wrote his legislation. He didn't know I wasn't a Republican, but I got the job, and it was kind of hard. I was out of my element, but that started probably because my undergraduate work was in speech language pathology, and I worked with a lot of kids who really had some severe impairments, so that's why I probably got that job. I'm sure I shared that with Ward. And much later then, one of my family members came out at a very unpopular time, which is becoming more and more unpopular again, as a gay person, and my parents were living in the middle of Kansas, and my parents a year later went to LA with parents from large cities. My parents were founding parents of PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. My mom's 97, and she's the only living parent who was one of the 15 parents who founded that. And so that was another experience for our family to get a little flavor of what it's like to be discriminated against, in a way, I guess you would say. And then I was in a partnership with a black man for about 5 years and in Portland, and experienced through him some of what we went through. But Ward was just, maybe those are things that he could connect to me about feeling a little bit of being an outsider in some ways. The way that Ward described taking photos was by being in a wheelchair and carrying his camera on his lap. He said he could go into the street people population and be very non-threatening. And I like, the way that you described all of that too, Carla, because he would really get to know someone. He would get to know the people. He wanted to know their stories, and they knew that, and he could see the light in their hearts among some of the darkness. I mean, that's how I think I saw what he saw. And so he also said that when he brought pictures back, the photos back to the people, that some of them got very tearful because they hadn't had a photo of themselves before. And so that was the sense that he had as far as really the love he had for other human beings. It was just amazing. I'm trying to think about a couple of other things. I mean, I think what happened also was that he could, when he was working on the phone with clients that we both worked with, it felt to me like he could see them through the phone in the same way he could see people through the photo lens on his camera. It was like he could actually see them and be with them and hear that in the same way he was when he was with people who were on the street. We used to go to lunch as coworkers. We'd go out to lunch, and when he got really ill, Carla had called and we met, and I went to the hospital at a time, that would have been in 2011 probably, Carla, that they were saying he was not going to make it. That was in 2011. So I went and sat with Carla and his palliative care team to just discuss some of the options, and it really was scary because I really thought that was going to be it. But he, in typical Ward fashion, he fought through that and came out from that until 2019. And after that, we would still, he'd come into town, drive his van in, and when he started feeling better, and meet all of us for lunch. He loved Indian food. We went to an Indian restaurant where, again, he had to go into the back door and through to get in because there were stairs going up. One evening, he drove over to my house, it was a distance for him to drive, and we were another couple that were friends of ours through work. He came over, and we did it was thank goodness summer, because we did a big picnic or patio barbecue, because he had to go through my garage and in through the garage and out to the patio because I had stairs going up to my house. But it was that constant thought of, how can we do this, and how he had to constantly think of all that. When he really wasn't able to work anymore, I went out one time, and one of my strong memories too is you were remodeling the house so that it'd be handicap fit, and you had this big sheet of plastic across the bedroom so that the dust and everything didn't get into the bedroom, and they were remodeling the bathroom, and I would go out. I went out a couple of times, and Carla would be in the kitchen, and I got in bed with him, and I would read to him things that he wanted to have read to him, and those were extremely special, tender times to connect with Ward. And then after that, I had my own health issues for about 5 years, and I felt really bad because I really wasn't able to spend a lot of time with him that I would have liked. But so what he did was, I said something that inspired him to go to his garage and to start making note cards and postcards, and I got the first 3 of them, and I put them, he sent those, and they were written on the back, notes to me. I put it, and I said, Carla, I don't know, I can't get this one to go straight, and she said, well, that's okay, because Word was kind of lopsided anyway. But, so they hang on my wall, and they're treasures because I can just go in and take it off the wall once in a while and read the messages that he had sent to me. So I do think that this last few days have brought Ward even closer and more deeply into our hearts. And I so appreciate all of you and everything you've done, and being here, and the family, and hearing from you, Matt. I hadn't really met you or heard your story before. I think that this world has been really blessed to have someone like Ward in it. And I want to hold on to that feeling of love that he gave in so many different ways. So thank all of you for being here.
Thank you, Rebecca. And thanks to all of you. You've painted this rich portrait, I think, across Ward's lifetime in the many ways that you have known him, but I think we're probably all hearing the similarities, we're hearing the threads that tie all of your experiences with him and knowing him in these different facets and different ways. So thank you. I think it's very touching and inspiring. For the sake of time, I just have one or two questions, but I do want to open it up to the audience. But I guess I would say, going back to his photography and what's happening in the room here, how do you think Ward wanted, or how did he expect or want his photography to be received during his lifetime? And also, what would he say about this show? Any of you may answer, please.
Well, I'll go first.
Sure.
If it's all right. I mean, like I alluded to in the beginning, I think that I think he did his work and he knew he was good at it. I think that the way you just asked the question, I think that the first and high above anything else was he was taking the pictures for the people in the pictures, you know? And so, and maybe a lot of you don't know this, that people that just came in for the afternoon, we had a memorial this morning, and so some of what you're hearing here and the emotions are coming from this larger gathering of people that came from out of town and people that loved Ward and Ward loved. So it may seem a little like, why is everybody talking about Ward and, you know, not more about the photography? But I think in the case of Ward's work, I mean, that's why I think he didn't really care so much about having a show. It's not because, I mean, he had an extensive photo book collection. He bought the best gear. And Ward was not just a photographer, he was also a musician and, you know, and a deep thinker. And I just think that, I mean, Matt or Carla could answer better if Ward would be happy that the show is up. But what was, can you?
Well, if he had certain expectations or he wanted people to see his work in a certain way, and I guess by the same token, why did he do it? Like, was he doing, and did you see him transform when he started to take photographs? Like, was it an outlet for him in many ways?
For me, and it's the way I take pictures, in fact, the Polaroid film that I started shooting, Ward gave me the box of this Type 55 because he couldn't shoot it anymore. And I knew right away when he gave it to me, I knew what that was about because it's a film that you can give a print right away and keep a negative. And Ward was like, yeah, I bought this stuff and I just can't operate the 4x5 and do this. But so it was just like, that was part of the kinship. Ward and I, when we'd go out and shoot, we would really enjoy not just shooting from afar, although I did see what Carla talked about. This is Ward's camera, and sometimes he would put it sideways and he'd be like looking, you know, he'd do that. He'd sit down next to somebody, you know, he was already sitting, but then he'd pull up and he'd be talking to them. And, you know, they knew what was going on, but, you know, but so I think for Ward, like for me and for a lot of street photographers, it's not just the picture, it's getting to spend time with people. It's a ticket to go out there in the world and connect, you know, and that's my perception of what makes Ward's work so special and good is, you know, I don't think every kind of street photography has that, you know, I always, Gary Winogrand or, other people I could name. They're not really trying to make that connection, you know what I mean? And there's a soul here and a spirit in every picture that I think is why Ward did it,
And maybe that's why I was naturally drawn to portraiture. I mean, you all talk about his humanity, and I see even the notion of the portrait in the Houses series.
Yeah, I want to say something about that too, because Ward, you made a good point, Carla. Ward, when he moved around there at the end a couple of times, and we'd go out shooting houses, and he'd say, "This neighbor's not good. These people haven't lived here long enough." He wasn't going after the ruined porn. He saw people in the way that they decorated, and it's written about in his words there. It was that kind of trying to create a facade of who you are, or an environment of who you are, and how over time, and it's like, yeah, he didn't want to go to a new neighborhood, and some other neighborhoods, they were just like, these people don't look like they've lived here long enough. There's just not signs of who inhabits this house. So they were portraits in a way, just a little more not trying to connect. He actually has some shots of houses with people, and we talked about that, but it was like, he wasn't focused on trying to get the people to come out, But he did have this idea. He wanted to have a show at Arbor Lodge at the Zebra there, because he wanted to do the same thing. He wanted the people whose houses he had shot to come and get a picture of their house, So he was clearly not trying to say your house is a dump or it's really run down and that's what's interesting. He was trying to say, I'm just interested in, who we are, and how we live.
So we'd like to take some questions from the audience if anyone has anything. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, I have a question, and perhaps it would be for Matt, but anyone, if the board ever shared with you. The very first time he picked up a camera, what was the impetus? What was the aha? When did you see something kind of change? And, oh yeah, this is something I really want to do. I want to learn more about it. And did he discuss what he was trying to pursue? In other words, were there any classes he took, were there any techniques he was going after as he was developing from that very early day when he first picked up a camera that you could share something about?
Well, one of the, I'm not sure if it was the first camera this is going to sound kind of egotistical, but one of the first cameras that he had, I think might have been my camera. And he had it downtown, and a number of times, it was a 35 millimeter Canon AE1, just kind of that I used in college a lot, and it got stolen out of his van. So, and I think he was taking it just because he was just sort of looking at this, there was this journey that he wanted to take. He didn't know what it was or where it was going or whatever, but he just was like, he just always wanted to venture into uncharted places, And I don't know what he did after that camera got taken. If he got right into the 2 1/4 and stuff, but I don't remember him ever taking a class or anything. I think he totally piled tons of books and stuff into his life, mainly like books of print, images more than like technical books, but he's really into Walker Evans and stuff like that, Dorothea Lange and who's the Diane Arbus. He was very, I think he was really intrigued with Diane Arbus like way back before. I think he had seen some. I remember looking at Diane Arbus stuff with him when we were younger and thinking, it was like sort of like freak show stuff for when we were teenagers. We were like, wow, this stuff's really weird, But
Not politically correct to say that.
No, not at all. But that's the way. That's
coming from Ward.
That's the way we thought. That was the language that we would have used back then, And but he was seeing, in the Diane Arbus stuff, I think he was seeing like, oh, this is like a place where he would want to go, I think. Even though we were kind of like, it was sort of like just, we were just like way on the outside looking into the world that Diane Arbus would was like threw herself into, I don't know that much about her story. I just know the work, but yeah, I don't know. Do you remember?
Yeah, he never told me. I don't know anything about any formal training that he ever had.
No, I mean, the only class that I knew of that he took before you was he was in Ray's class the weekend, actually, that your dad died, because it was like a Saturday, the tintype photography.
Ray Bittigan, yeah.
Yeah. So he went on a Saturday and learned that John had been killed and was sort of wondering, should I go back on Sunday? And I was like, yeah, you should definitely go back.
Yeah.
But that, yeah.
But he set up the dark room in Maryland, but I don't know how he figured out how to do all that other than just by getting books out of the library and stuff, as far as I know.
He was very particular in all things technical. He had to have the best gear, and when I was printing these pictures, I mean, there were, on every negative that he had printed, there were notes, like all photographers would do in the darkroom, but, like everyone is different. The way his notes, first of all, he's using green and yellow filters rather than red, like normal. It's weird stuff, he had a particular developer. He had little syringes that he would measure out the developer from the liquid, and everything he did. And a lot of my darkroom equipment that he gave to me, is all the best.
Yeah.
And he had quite a big library of photography books. So I think a lot of it, he read a lot of books on photography.
Yeah. It was all pre-YouTube,
Yeah. I mean, he built his first computer, so.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, a number of things that you each said sort of fit together to me in a way. I mean, when Carla talked about how his sister was the only one who really saw him, and Rebecca, when you talked about, gee, these people didn't have pictures of themselves, so it meant a lot to them. But I think what they more didn't have is somebody who actually saw them. And I think that's what Bobby was saying. It's like the person that it was important for him to connect with was the subject. I'm making a picture of you because I want you to know that I see you. And that's so powerful. And it's like, for somebody else to witness that as we do in the gallery is obviously a less profound thing than for that subject to be seen that way. And of course, Arbus is that's what she did. I mean, nobody has seen their subjects as well as Arbus in the history of photography. So that makes sense that would be that's the class.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that conversation. No, he didn't have any formal training. And 35 probably was the first one. I was with him on a lot of night stalking missions when he started the photography, and it was absolutely never the case that he would shoot somebody he just met. I mean, he shot after he'd encountered, there'd been at a camp for 3 or 4 times. That camera was never the object. That camera was there to attempt to capture a moment in a deeper conversation. And I think that it evolved. I mean, he wanted to pursue the art. He talked to people who understood. He did get training later in the art. And the result is phenomenal. That he was able to, I think, meet his goal of capturing that moment and actually being able to convey it.
And I would say, having printed and looked through all of his negatives, his ratio of good images, both visually or content-wise as well as technically. I mean, maybe it's helpful that he's got the camera on the tripod and he kind of positions himself where he wants, and he just spends a lot of time. But yeah, they're tack sharp, and there's that one picture on the back of the book where the eyes are foggy, and somebody asked me that on Thursday night, and I said, I imagine it's because it was a slow shutter speed, and that's the movement of the eyes. I mean, you just kind of picture that. And I saw it enough personally, just, the intensity, but also really chilled. There was no hunger and, urgency or need to get it, but he was really good. He's a real good photographer, I would say.
Well, and let me just add to that, is kind of like what he said in one of his writings was he could see art, the similarities between art and therapy, and that the best art and therapy come from that unconditional sense of love, non-judgment, and deeply really wanting to know. And I think like what you're saying is to deeply see and have no judgment. To me, that's how I see his photos. I mean, you just feel the photo, and that's how I think that's how he did his work. He felt it that way.
Both that you talked about, that each of you experienced just something very special. It seems like in the everyday, he would say something or do something or put something together that would just wow you. And all of you had the same experience. And it seems like these type of photographs come from that same experience with them. Is that a special experience that happened all the time with me? And these people, that's what, for them it was as fresh to them as it was to you. And it was this, and I think that's why the looks are so fresh, because they are. He seemed to be just a remarkable person that you were aware of constantly. And it seems like that's what he was capturing, something very, very special that becomes very universal. There's just an uncanniness, but it seems like he experienced people, the experience that they had with it was very similar with the experience that you had with it, which is special moments and a look or a feeling that is kind of unique. And that's what you got from him. It's just very emotional.
Yeah.
Very emotional.
Well, one final question I have is what happens with the archive now? Bobby, what's your big vision?
Well, I wrote that I hold it. I was careful to say I don't own it.
Okay.
I still need to have a conversation with the family to decide what they want to do. I don't have an answer. I'm happy to hold on to it. I'd rather it find a home where as many people as possible could see it. But having sort of thought about my own work and what's going to happen when I pass, it's easier to say what you're going to do than to do it, they might take a set of prints from Portland here at some place, but then there's DuPont Circle, and then there's Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then there's the negatives, and then there's, So it's one reason we price the work cheaply is so that I don't want to say cheap like cheap, but it's not as much as I would sell my work for. Affordable, thank you. And why, we're not looking to get any money back from it. We're giving money to PAIR, which works with street kids here in Portland, and Blue Sky Gallery. The idea is I'd love everybody to buy every one of these. I think that's what Ward would be happy with too, And I was talking to somebody who works at Portland Darkroom, and that picture right there of the man with the cigarette is hanging in Portland Darkroom, because when Portland Darkroom inherited some of the stuff from New Space, that was at New Space. So they're like, we already got a picture of Ward's up here, So it'd be great if, you see something you like,
Yeah, and to know that this whole show is like in everybody's hands together would be really, that's exactly, to have it all go in a closet somewhere would really be a drag,
Well, I think we could probably talk for hours, but we do have to come to an end. But I want to thank you all for spending your time and energy and really sharing who Ward was as a person and photographer and brother and coworker and colleague and husband. So thank you very much, and to the audience too. Thank you.